Toyota is officially back in the Formula One paddock, but they absolutely did not buy an existing constructor or spend billions of dollars to build a brand new hybrid power unit from scratch. Instead, they cracked open the dense pages of the FIA's Transferable Components Rulebook to legally hijack Haas's entire grid operation. Gene Haas is completely burnt out on pouring his personal capital into a midfield void, and his new team principal, Ayao Komatsu, just traded the operational keys to the castle for direct access to top-tier global manufacturing power without technically breaking the rigid cost cap limits. It is a brilliant, ruthless corporate Trojan horse that bypasses massive entry fees and leaves the rest of the independent teams completely scrambling for answers. Right now, the balance of power on the grid is undergoing a massive structural shift as legacy independent outfits are being brutally squeezed out by mega corporations like Audi and Ford, making actual survival entirely dependent on finding massive technical loopholes. Before we break down the exact wording of the chassis clause that allowed this hostile infiltration, hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comments, is this a genius survival tactic by Gene Haas, or a blatant regulatory breach hiding in plain sight? Let's tear apart the exact technical loophole that made this corporate takeover entirely possible. Formula One is a sport heavily bound by rigid legal definitions, and the most critical definition in the current rulebook dictates what exactly makes a racing team an actual constructor. To understand how Toyota Gazoo Racing just slipped straight through the back door, you have to completely understand the fundamental engineering DNA of the Haas F1 team. Since their grid inception, Haas has never operated like a traditional racing outfit stationed in a singular factory. It is the old Hollywood studio business model applied to a 200-mile-per-hour gunfight. Haas strictly owns the entry ticket, the branding, and the external distribution rights, but the actual physical production of the high-speed machinery is contracted out to highly specialized external vendors located across the globe. They buy every single legal piece of hardware allowed directly from Scuderia Ferrari. Under the strict regulations of Appendix 6 of the FIA sporting regulations, racing components are heavily categorized to prevent cloning. You have your transferable components, commonly referred to as TRCs, which legally include the gearbox cassette, the internal suspension mechanisms, the complete hybrid power unit, and the complex hydraulic systems. Haas buys all of this hardware directly off the shelf from Maranello, but the governing body aggressively restricts what they call non-transferable components, or NTCs. To legally be considered a constructor and secure a place in the championship, a team absolutely must own the intellectual property rights for the carbon survival cell, the primary aerodynamic surfaces, and the heavy impact roll structures. The core chassis must be entirely and legally yours. But here is the savage loophole that Ayao Komatsu just exploited with surgical precision. The FIA regulations heavily dictate that a team must legally own the intellectual property of the chassis. The rules strictly do not dictate that a team's full-time salaried employees must manufacture that chassis inside a completely dedicated factory that the team exclusively owns. Since 2016, Haas has outsourced the physical manufacturing of their carbon fiber tub to Dallara in Italy. Dallara physically builds the car, Haas slaps their intellectual property tag on it, and the FIA signs off on the official homologation paperwork. Now, substitute Dallara with the immense corporate might of Toyota Gazoo Racing. Toyota possesses one of the most technologically advanced and highly secretive wind tunnels in Europe, located in Cologne, Germany. They have elite, world-class carbon composite manufacturing capabilities, honed directly through their heavily dominant Le Mans hypercar endurance program. Komatsu realized that Haas could legally contract Toyota engineers to work directly under the Haas IP umbrella. These Toyota engineers are not technically designing a Toyota Formula One car. On official legal paper, they are designing a Haas Formula One car. They are wearing Haas credentials, utilizing Toyota's heavy manufacturing machinery, and generating massive amounts of aerodynamic load data that belongs exclusively to Gene Haas. If you were a rival team principal running a midfield team restricted by your own outdated factory infrastructure, would you protest this immediately to the FIA, or would you quietly try to copy this exact framework with another manufacturer? The operational reality of integrating a massive automotive giant into the smallest team on the grid requires navigating the absolute minefield of the FIA financial regulations. The current cost cap strictly limits base performance spending to $135 million annually. If Toyota simply decided to give Haas a massive, multi-million-dollar discount on advanced aerodynamic research and carbon development, the FIA would immediately intervene. The governing body uses incredibly strict fair value assessments to ensure teams are not getting illegal under-the-table discounts from massive parent companies or major technical partners to artificially bypass the spending limits. So, how exactly do Komatsu and Toyota balance the massive financial scales without immediately triggering a brutal forensic audit? They created an elaborate, highly technical barter system. It is a pure exchange of highly coveted operational services and trackside data. Toyota desperately wants their young driver academy prospects, like Ritomo Miyata, to get actual Formula One testing mileage under their belts. They need their domestic engineering staff to deeply understand the granular complexity of modern Formula One telemetry loops and hybrid deployment strategies. Haas, on the other hand, desperately needs elite simulation correlation data, high-grade physical carbon manufacturing, and fully dedicated track testing programs. This is exactly where the testing of previous cars, or TPC regulations, come into play. The FIA currently allows unlimited track testing of cars that are at least 2 years old. Historically, Haas has had absolutely zero operating budget to run a proper TPC program. It costs millions of dollars to fly dedicated engineers to a remote track, fire up a complex hybrid engine, run the necessary track sessions, and process the endless terabytes of telemetry data. Toyota has now confidently stepped in to fund and execute the entire Haas TPC program. Toyota gets their young drivers behind the wheel of an actual Formula One car, generating immense domestic marketing value and driver development. In return, Haas gets massive amounts of completely free trackside telemetry data, complex tire degradation models, and vital correlation data necessary to properly calibrate their simulator back at the base. Overnight, the internal structure of the team has been entirely transformed. It is exactly like a local dive bar getting turned into a premium sushi restaurant while firmly keeping the original neon sign out front. Gene Haas keeps his name legally on the lease, but Toyota Gazoo Racing is firmly standing in the kitchen, supplying the absolute highest grade components available on the open market. Furthermore, consider the extremely strict aerodynamic testing restrictions, or ATR. Formula One operates on a competitive sliding scale, where lower-placing teams are granted significantly more wind tunnel testing hours to help close the grid gap. Haas consistently finishes in the lower half of the constructors' standings, meaning they hold a massive allocation of highly valuable aerodynamic testing time. Historically, they have heavily struggled to maximize this exact time due to strict internal staffing limits and persistent manufacturing bottlenecks. Now, they can confidently execute those extra testing hours strictly inside Toyota's hyper-efficient, state-of-the-art facility in Cologne. The Toyota facility houses a 60% scale, dual-belt rolling road that is light years ahead of standard commercial testing tunnels. From a strict regulatory auditing perspective, policing this exact engineering partnership is like trying to track a user running an anti-detect multi-profile browser setup through a highly complex proxy network. The digital fingerprints and operational actions are deliberately scattered across completely different servers, making it nearly impossible for the FIA to pinpoint exactly where Haas engineering securely ends and Toyota intellectual property legally begins. We are currently looking at a fundamental shift in how a modern racing chassis is physically born. Do you think the FIA's current auditing tools, which heavily rely on basic financial accounting and factory limitations, are even capable of tracking intellectual property swaps happening entirely in the cloud between North Carolina, Maranello, and Cologne? To truly grasp the massive magnitude of this engineering shift, we absolutely must look at the previous manufacturing limitations weighing Haas down. Dallara has been a fiercely loyal partner to Haas since day one, but Dallara is fundamentally a volume manufacturer built to supply racing series in bulk. They efficiently produce spec chassis for Formula 2, Formula 3, and IndyCar grids. They are strictly not engineered to engage in an intense, highly reactionary week-by-week Formula One development war, where carbon upgrades are needed in exactly 14 days. Toyota builds purely bespoke, championship-winning endurance prototypes. Toyota brings a relentless level of carbon composite efficiency and rapid prototyping that Dallara simply cannot match physically. Ayao Komatsu understands this deeply. As a highly experienced vehicle engineering specialist, who cut his teeth actively analyzing raw telemetry loops for BAR Honda and Renault, Komatsu specifically knew that the fundamental tire carcass temperature issues plaguing the previous Haas chassis designs could not be properly fixed without completely overhauling the actual external manufacturing pipeline. The intensely human and corporate fallout of this aggressive maneuver cannot be accurately overstated. Gene Haas has spent the better part of a full decade aggressively pouring his personal machine tool fortune into a midfield racing operation that was slowly, inevitably bleeding out cash. It is the classic, recurring narrative of owner exhaustion in modern elite motorsport. The heavy financial squeeze of operating a completely independent team under the current strict regulations is absolutely brutal. It is a python slowly swallowing a rabbit. You are constantly constrained by incredibly strict capital expenditure limits, unable to build the necessary infrastructure to fight at the very front, while simultaneously watching your daily operating costs heavily skyrocket just to maintain the current status quo. Komatsu fully recognized this deep owner burnout and played a highly dangerous, yet entirely necessary strategic game. By executing this specific technical partnership, he is effectively leasing the operational soul of the team to a massive global manufacturer without fully selling the naming rights. The reaction across the entire grid has been absolute shock, heavily mixed with deep, burning frustration. Midfield rivals like Williams, Aston Martin, and Sauber are currently pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into highly localized capital expenditure projects. They are painstakingly building entirely new wind tunnels, massive heavy fabrication plants, and advanced simulation campuses over multiple agonizing years. Haas just completely bypassed that entire agonizing financial process. They effortlessly skipped the brutal CapEx queue and essentially bought their way directly into an elite, fully operational facility via a legally structured localized service contract. Look at the sheer structural leverage Toyota has just manufactured for themselves over the next few consecutive seasons. If they eventually decide to fully enter Formula One as a dedicated works team in the future, they already have a highly advanced, fully operational shadow operation running directly on the actual grid. Are we actively watching a mutually beneficial technical partnership, or a slow-motion hostile corporate takeover heavily hiding behind a friendly, smiling press release? The raw psychological stakes for the actual Haas engineers, actively working out of the Banbury facility in the United Kingdom, are intensely complicated right now. Who exactly do they work for on a daily basis? Are they purely Haas employees desperately trying to maintain control? Or are they functionally operating as mere project managers heavily directing a massive fleet of contracted Toyota engineering staff? The overarching independent team identity is fundamentally fractured at its core. But out on the actual track, this specific structural arrangement makes Haas incredibly dangerous in the tight midfield battles. Attempting to fight a heavily Toyota-backed engineering squad using strictly legacy independent team infrastructure is literally bringing a knife to a 200 miles per hour gunfight. The raw resources simply do not match up anymore. If this highly outsourced manufacturing model proves heavily successful on the official timing screens this season, does the traditional Formula One constructor model completely die today? Will we see more massive automotive giants completely sidestep the $200 million anti-dilution entry fee by simply renting a struggling midfield team's aerodynamic testing restrictions indefinitely? The massive regulation overhaul heavily arriving in the upcoming season is aggressively looming over the entire Formula One grid. With the mandatory introduction of fully active aero elements and incredibly demanding electrical battery requirements, the actual financial cost of designing a highly competitive chassis is about to explode exponentially. Haas has now fully secured the highly advanced manufacturing might and raw engineering headcount desperately necessary to actively survive this brutal technical transition without Gene Haas having to sell his controlling equity stake in the racing team outright. On the exact other side of the complex equation, Toyota immediately secures a highly active, real-world Formula One research and development program without taking on the immense political risk and heavy financial burden of actively fielding a failing works team under their own corporate banner. It is a parasitic, brilliantly executed engineering symbiosis that the FIA's current rulebook simply cannot legally outlaw without entirely destroying the customer team supply model that literally keeps the bottom half of the entire grid alive. The loophole remains completely, legally wide open for business. Is the new Haas and Toyota alliance actively destroying the fiercely independent spirit of the true Formula One constructor, or are they simply the only team smart enough to legally survive the ruthless modern era of the mega manufacturer? Drop your final verdict directly in the comments below.